Fly this helicopter and I'll give you a raise.
CEO Diana Sterling declared with frustrated sarcasm as she stood beside the emergency medical helicopter on Skyward Aviation's rooftop helipad. Addressing the statement to Leon Washington, who was cleaning windows during his routine night custodial duties, her desperation about the medical emergency making her mock the very idea that a janitor could operate the sophisticated aircraft that her trained pilots had abandoned due to safety concerns. At 35, Leon had perfected the professional invisibility that characterized maintenance workers in aviation environments, moving through Skyward's hangars and offices while overhearing flight operations, personnel decisions, and discriminatory conversations that pilots and executives conducted freely around someone they considered irrelevant to their technical operations and business strategies. But the Bell 407 helicopter sitting idle on the helipad was identical to aircraft Leon had piloted during 8 years of exemplary military service before systematic racism had destroyed his commercial aviation career and forced him into employment that concealed rather than celebrated his exceptional flight expertise. "Ma'am, I'm serious about accepting that challenge," Leon said quietly, his voice carrying the calm confidence that had once characterized his communication during complex aviation operations before prejudice had made his qualifications invisible to civilian employers. Diana looked up from her desperate phone calls to emergency services with surprise that quickly shifted to curious attention rather than the dismissive irritation that characterized most executives when maintenance workers interrupted critical business operations. At 30, Diana possessed the kind of striking blonde beauty and sharp business intelligence that had enabled her to build Skyward Aviation into a major government contractor through legitimate expertise in corporate management. Though her success in executive leadership hadn't exposed her to the systematic discrimination that affected hiring and advancement in technical aviation positions. "You're serious about flying a helicopter?" Diana asked, her tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than condescension, suggesting she was processing information that challenged her assumptions about talent distribution and professional qualifications. "Yes, ma'am. I have 12 years of military helicopter experience, including medical evacuation, search and rescue, and precision flight operations in challenging conditions," Leon replied, though his chest was tightening with anxiety about revealing professional background that could expose him to questions about his current employment circumstances. Diana studied his face with the analytical attention she brought to evaluating potential business partners, recognizing something in his manner and vocabulary that suggested sophisticated aviation training despite his working in custodial services. "Military helicopter experience," Diana repeated, processing information that could either solve their immediate crisis or represent elaborate deception by someone seeking attention during emergency circumstances. "I was a helicopter pilot in the Army for 12 years, including combat operations and civilian emergency response, before transitioning to civilian employment," Leon explained, using deliberately measured language to acknowledge his qualifications without providing details about career destruction and systematic exclusion from commercial aviation. The emergency situation involved a construction worker who had fallen from an offshore oil platform and needed immediate medical evacuation to a trauma center, but every qualified pilot in the region had declared the weather conditions too dangerous for civilian flight operations. "Mr. Diana began, realizing she didn't know the name of the person who might be able to conduct the rescue mission that her credentialed pilots had refused to attempt. "Washington. Leon Washington. Mr. Washington, if you have military aviation experience, why are you working in custodial services instead of flying commercially?" Diana asked, with the direct questioning style that characterized executives accustomed to evaluating personnel qualifications and professional histories. The question was both inevitable and painful, requiring Leon to address the systematic discrimination that had made his transition from military to civilian aviation impossible despite his exceptional technical competence and unblemished safety record. Ms. Sterling, I wasn't able to obtain commercial aviation employment despite my military qualifications due to barriers that had nothing to do with my flying abilities or safety record, Leon replied carefully, using diplomatic language to indicate discrimination without making accusations that could be dismissed as unfounded complaints. What kind of barriers prevent qualified military pilots from obtaining commercial positions? Subjective evaluation criteria that can be influenced by personal bias, networking requirements that favor certain demographic groups, and institutional practices that make it difficult for some qualified candidates to advance regardless of their technical competence. Diana processed this information with growing recognition that her confidence in aviation industry hiring practices might be based on incomplete understanding of how discrimination could affect talent recognition and career advancement. Mr. Washington, are you legally qualified to pilot our aircraft for emergency medical evacuation? Diana asked, her question both practical and complex, since unauthorized commercial aviation could create massive liability, regardless of expertise or emergency circumstances. I maintain current medical certification, instrument ratings, and emergency response training, but I don't hold commercial licenses due to systematic exclusion from civilian aviation opportunities rather than any deficiency in qualifications or safety record, Leon replied. You're saying you were discriminated against in civilian aviation hiring? The direct question forced Leon to acknowledge what he'd been diplomatically avoiding, that his career destruction had resulted from racism rather than professional inadequacy. Yes, ma'am. I believe that racial bias prevented me from obtaining positions that matched my qualifications, and that systematic discrimination in aviation hiring has wasted expertise that could benefit companies and save lives. As Diana weighed the choice between allowing a critical injury to worsen while waiting for pilots who had refused emergency response versus trusting rescue operations to someone whose aviation credentials had been marginalized by industry discrimination, both understood that their decision would have consequences extending far beyond immediate crisis resolution. Mr. Washington, what are the risks if I authorize you to conduct this medical evacuation flight? Diana asked, her executive training demanding comprehensive risk assessment even during emergency circumstances. The primary risks are legal liability for unauthorized commercial aviation and potential equipment issues if I'm unfamiliar with this specific aircraft model, Leon replied honestly. But I'm confident in my ability to safely conduct emergency medical evacuation based on my military training and ongoing proficiency maintenance. And you believe the weather conditions that prevented our commercial pilots from flying are manageable for someone with your background? Ms. Sterling, the current conditions are challenging but well within normal parameters for military emergency response operations. The reluctance of civilian pilots to accept standard operational risk suggests either inadequate training or excessive risk aversion that prioritizes personal comfort over emergency response responsibilities. The assessment was both tactful and pointed, suggesting that qualified pilots' refusal to fly reflected professional limitations rather than legitimate safety concerns. 9-year-old Phoenix would be waking in 5 hours expecting help with her mathematics homework and breakfast conversation about perseverance and justice, unaware that her father was about to demonstrate the aviation expertise he'd been concealing to protect her from disappointment about systematic barriers that had prevented his professional advancement. Ms. Sterling, I need you to understand that conducting this flight represents my first return to emergency aviation since leaving military service, Leon said, establishing realistic expectations while committing to attempt the rescue mission. But I also need you to understand that saving someone's life is more important than protecting myself from legal or professional complications that might result from unauthorized commercial aviation. The moral framework was both admirable and concerning, revealing someone whose dedication to helping others could override reasonable self-protection during circumstances that required careful risk evaluation. Mr. Washington, what do you need from me to safely conduct this evacuation? Diana asked, recognizing that emergency aviation success would require rapid coordination and comprehensive support rather than just individual heroism. Weather updates, medical communication with the trauma center, and acknowledgement that I'm acting under emergency circumstances rather than seeking commercial employment that could create ongoing legal complications, Leon replied. As they prepared for emergency flight operations that would either demonstrate Leon's exceptional qualifications or expose both of them to significant legal and safety risks, Diana began to understand that systematic discrimination might have hidden valuable expertise in places where she'd never thought to look for professional competence. Some discoveries require recognizing that the most qualified people are often invisible due to institutional barriers rather than lack of capability, and sometimes emergency circumstances create opportunities for demonstrating expertise that normal hiring processes systematically exclude. The investigation that would reshape Diana's understanding of aviation industry discrimination began at 7:30 a.m. the following morning, when she arrived at Skyward Aviation carrying comprehensive research about Leon Washington's military service record and a growing recognition of how systematic racism could exclude qualified professionals regardless of their actual competence or safety performance. Mr. Washington, Diana said, finding Leon in the aircraft maintenance hangar where he was cleaning equipment while processing the psychological aftermath of successfully completing his first emergency flight in 4 years. I spent most of the night researching your military aviation record and the barriers you mentioned regarding civilian employment. Leon felt the familiar anxiety spike that accompanied any inquiry into his professional background, uncertain whether Diana's investigation indicated respect for his demonstrated competence or concern about employing someone whose career transition involved allegations of industry discrimination that could create controversy for her company. Ms. Sterling, I understand that my situation raises questions about why qualified military pilots don't automatically transition to civilian aviation careers, Leon replied, using careful language for addressing potential concerns about his professional reliability while maintaining emotional boundaries that protected him from painful memories of systematic rejection. Mr. Washington, you weren't just a military helicopter pilot, Diana said, her voice carrying focused attention that characterized executives processing information that fundamentally altered their understanding of personnel and industry practices. You were a chief warrant officer with commendations for exceptional performance, 0 safety violations, and leadership roles in complex emergency operations. The recognition was both validating and concerning, confirming that Diana now understood his aviation achievements while potentially exposing him to expectations and scrutiny that could recreate the professional pressure that had contributed to his employment difficulties. Yes, ma'am, that's accurate. But I also need you to understand that military performance doesn't automatically translate to civilian employment opportunities, especially when subjective evaluation criteria can be influenced by personal or institutional bias. Leon explained, his honesty about discrimination both personally vulnerable and professionally necessary. What specific discrimination did you experience when applying for civilian aviation positions? Diana asked, her tone carrying business-like directness that indicated she was seeking information for strategic evaluation rather than personal judgment about controversial allegations. The question required Leon to revisit the most frustrating period of his professional life, when exceptional qualifications had been consistently overlooked through hiring processes that seemed designed to exclude rather than identify the most capable candidates. I submitted applications to 47 aviation companies over 18 months after leaving military service, Leon said, his voice carrying controlled emotion about circumstances that had systematically wasted his expertise despite clear evidence of exceptional competence. I received callbacks for 12 interviews, completed flight evaluations for 6 positions, and was told repeatedly that they had decided to hire candidates with better cultural fit or more relevant civilian experience, despite my superior technical qualifications and safety record. Diana processed this information with growing recognition that her assumptions about merit-based hiring in aviation might be contradicted by systematic patterns that excluded qualified professionals based on characteristics unrelated to flying ability. Mr. Washington, did you document these hiring decisions or file complaints about potential discrimination? Diana asked, her executive experience with personnel issues making her understand both the importance of documentation and the practical difficulties of proving discrimination in subjective hiring processes. I consulted with employment attorneys who explained that aviation discrimination is extremely difficult to prove legally because hiring decisions can be justified through subjective criteria like communication style, team compatibility, and cultural alignment that mask racial bias while appearing to be legitimate business considerations. The explanation revealed systematic exclusion disguised as professional evaluation, suggesting that Leon's career difficulties resulted from institutional discrimination rather than individual inadequacy or professional limitations. And that's why you transitioned to custodial work instead of continuing to pursue aviation employment. I transitioned to custodial work because I needed stable income to support my daughter, and because continued rejection from aviation positions was creating psychological stress that affected my ability to provide stable parenting during her elementary school years. Meanwhile, 9-year-old Phoenix was experiencing her own curiosity about her father's sudden return to aviation activities and the change in his mood following his successful emergency flight the previous evening. "Dad, you seem different since you flew the helicopter yesterday," Phoenix observed during their morning breakfast routine, her emotional intelligence recognizing that her father was processing professional satisfaction he hadn't experienced in years. "Are you thinking about being a pilot again?" At 9, Phoenix possessed mathematical abilities and logical thinking skills that had already exceeded grade-level expectations, though she'd learned not to discuss her father's aviation background with teachers or classmates who didn't understand why someone so qualified would work in custodial services. "Phoenix, flying that helicopter yesterday reminded me of work I used to love, but it also reminded me of the reasons why I had to stop doing that work," Leon replied, using honest communication while protecting his daughter from details about systematic discrimination and professional rejection. "Are those reasons still problems, or did something change when you helped save that person's life?" Phoenix asked, her question revealing mature understanding of how successful performance could alter professional circumstances and opportunities. "That's a very thoughtful question, sweetheart. Some of the reasons might have changed, but I need to be careful about making decisions that could affect our family's stability if aviation work doesn't turn out to be as available as it might seem." The conversation was both practical family planning and psychological processing, requiring Leon to balance professional opportunities against parental responsibilities while managing anxiety about returning to industry environments that had previously rejected his qualifications. Later that morning, Diana called a meeting with her senior aviation staff to address pilot performance issues and hiring practices that had been exposed by the previous day's emergency response failure and Leon's successful flight completion. "I want to discuss why our qualified pilots were unavailable for emergency medical evacuation while a maintenance worker was willing and able to successfully complete the mission," Diana announced to Chief Pilot Captain Jake Morrison and Operations Director Sarah Chen. Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing that questioning pilot decision-making could expose professional limitations and decision-making criteria that he preferred to keep private. "Ms. Sterling, civilian aviation operates under different safety standards than military operations," Morrison replied, his tone carrying defensive authority about aviation decision-making. "Our pilots correctly prioritized safety over emergency response when weather conditions exceeded civilian operational parameters." "Aye, Captain Morrison, the weather conditions were successfully managed by someone with appropriate training and experience," Diana replied, her voice indicating that she was evaluating explanations rather than accepting them without scrutiny. "I'm concerned that our hiring and operational practices may be preventing us from recognizing and utilizing available aviation expertise." The discussion continued for 2 hours, with Diana gradually discovering that Skyward Aviation's hiring practices included subjective evaluation criteria and informal networking requirements that could systematically exclude qualified candidates while maintaining the appearance of merit-based selection. "Diana, I want to be clear about something," Morrison said as their meeting concluded, his voice carrying warning about potential complications. "Allowing unqualified personnel to conduct commercial aviation operations creates liability issues that could jeopardize our government contracts and insurance coverage." Captain Morrison, yesterday's emergency response suggests that our definition of qualified personnel might need revision based on demonstrated competence rather than just formal credentials, Diana replied. As their conversation ended with unresolved tension about aviation standards and hiring practices, Diana realized that her company's emergency response failure had exposed systematic issues that extended beyond individual pilot performance to institutional practices that could be wasting valuable expertise while maintaining discriminatory hiring standards. "Mr. Washington," Diana said during their follow-up meeting, "I want to offer you an opportunity to demonstrate your aviation capabilities through formal evaluation that could lead to permanent employment in flight operations." The offer was both generous recognition and potential exposure to exactly the kind of professional scrutiny that had previously resulted in systematic rejection despite his exceptional qualifications. "Ms. Sterling, I appreciate the opportunity, but I need you to understand that formal aviation evaluation could expose both of us to industry criticism and potential legal challenges from personnel who might view my advancement as inappropriate preferential treatment," Leon replied. "Some moral choices require acknowledging that challenging systematic discrimination often involves personal risk for both those who have been excluded and those who attempt to provide opportunities that institutional bias has prevented." 3 weeks after accepting Diana's offer to undergo formal flight evaluation, Leon found himself experiencing the familiar mixture of professional excitement and racial anxiety that came from returning to aviation environments where his competence would be scrutinized by the same industry professionals who had systematically excluded him from employment despite his exceptional qualifications. Dad, you look nervous but happy, 9-year-old Phoenix observed from across their small kitchen table where she was working on an aerodynamics project while monitoring her father's emotional state with the intuitive precision that characterized children who had learned to recognize when adult career decisions could affect family stability. Phoenix, I'm preparing for flight tests that could help me return to pilot work, but I'm also worried that the same problems I faced before might happen again, Leon replied, though his voice carried anticipation that indicated he was processing opportunities he'd thought were permanently lost due to systematic discrimination. The formal evaluation process at Skyward Aviation had required Leon to demonstrate proficiency across multiple aircraft types, while being observed by federal aviation inspectors and company executives whose assessment would determine whether his military experience translated to civilian commercial standards. Dad, what happens if the airplane people decide you're good enough to be a pilot again? Phoenix asked, her question revealing both excitement about her father's potential career advancement and concern about changes that could disrupt the financial stability they'd built through his custodial employment. If I pass the evaluations, I might be able to work as a pilot, while also maintaining some custodial responsibilities until we're sure the flying job is permanent and secure, Leon explained, using careful planning language to acknowledge opportunities while protecting against disappointment if aviation employment proved temporary or unstable. The conversation was taking place at 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning, before Leon's comprehensive flight examination that would include instrument procedures, emergency response scenarios, and crew resource management assessments designed to evaluate both technical competence and professional judgment under pressure. Mr. Washington, Diana had said during their preparation meeting the previous day, I want you to understand that this evaluation process is being conducted under unusual scrutiny because some industry professionals have questioned whether military aviation experience adequately prepares pilots for civilian commercial operations. Ms. Sterling, what kind of questioning are you referring to? Leon had asked, recognizing that challenges to his qualifications might reflect the same discriminatory attitudes that had prevented his civilian employment previously. Captain Morrison and several external aviation consultants have suggested that military pilots may lack the civilian mindset necessary for commercial aviation safety and customer service excellence, Diana had replied, her tone indicating that she was reporting others' concerns rather than sharing her own doubts about his capabilities. The criticism was both professionally insulting and strategically concerning, suggesting that Leon's evaluation would involve defending military aviation training against civilian industry biases that portrayed combat experience as liability rather than asset. What specific concerns have been raised about military aviation background? Leon had pressed, understanding that identifying discriminatory criteria would be essential for addressing them during formal evaluation. Concerns about aggressive flying techniques, inappropriate risk tolerance, and difficulty adapting to civilian regulatory environments that might make military pilots unsuitable for commercial passenger operations. The objections were coded language for systematic exclusion that used professional-sounding criteria to justify discrimination against veterans whose technical competence exceeded civilian training standards in most operational areas. Now, as Leon prepared for evaluation that could either vindicate his qualifications or confirm industry biases against military aviation backgrounds, he was discovering that Phoenix had been conducting her own research about discrimination in aviation hiring. Dad, I read online that lots of companies say they want to hire military pilots, but then they find reasons not to hire them because of things that have nothing to do with flying airplanes, Phoenix said, displaying printouts from aviation employment websites and discrimination complaint databases. Phoenix, where did you find information about aviation hiring discrimination? Leon asked, surprised by his daughter's independent research into issues he'd been trying to protect her from understanding. I use the computer at school to research why good pilots like you have trouble getting pilot jobs, and I found lots of stories about companies that say they support veterans but then don't hire them because of made-up reasons. The research was both impressive and concerning, revealing that Phoenix understood more about systematic discrimination than he'd realized, while demonstrating analytical skills that exceeded typical 9-year-old capabilities. "What did you learn from your research?" Leon asked, recognizing that his daughter's investigation might have identified patterns he hadn't fully recognized. "I learned that companies sometimes say military pilots are too aggressive or don't fit company culture. But what they really mean is that they don't want to hire black pilots or pilots who might be better than the white pilots they already have." The analysis was both sophisticated and heartbreaking, showing that Phoenix had processed systematic racism with clarity that many adults struggled to acknowledge directly. 3 days later, Leon's flight evaluation reached crisis point when Captain Morrison attempted to create artificial emergencies and equipment failures designed to demonstrate that military pilots couldn't adapt to civilian aviation standards and safety requirements. "Washington, you're approaching that landing too aggressively for civilian passenger comfort standards," Morrison reported to Diana during Leon's practical examination, his critique focusing on technique rather than safety or regulatory compliance. "Captain Morrison, Mr. Washington's approach was within all federal aviation requirements and demonstrated exceptional precision under challenging conditions," replied Inspector Jennifer Martinez, the FAA official conducting the formal evaluation. "Inspector Martinez, civilian aviation requires different sensibilities than military operations," Morrison insisted, his tone carrying authority about industry standards that civilian regulators might not fully understand. The conflict was both professional disagreement and systematic attempt to disqualify Leon through subjective criteria that could override objective performance measurements and regulatory compliance. "Captain Morrison, I need specific safety violations or regulatory non-compliance to justify negative evaluation," Inspector Martinez replied, her federal authority trumping company preferences about pilot selection criteria. As the evaluation continued, with Morrison creating increasingly artificial challenges, while Inspector Martinez documented Leon's exceptional performance across all technical and safety requirements, both Diana and Phoenix watched from the observation area with growing understanding that systematic discrimination required active resistance rather than passive acceptance. "Ms. Sterling," Phoenix said during a break in the evaluation, "Captain Morrison is being mean to my dad because he doesn't want him to get the pilot job, not because my dad isn't good enough to fly helicopters." The 9-year-old's observation was both accurate and strategic, providing Diana with clear perspective on personnel dynamics that she might have misinterpreted as legitimate professional evaluation. "Phoenix, what makes you think Captain Morrison is being unfair to your father?" Diana asked, recognizing that child witnesses often notice discrimination that adults learn to rationalize or ignore. "Because he keeps making up problems that aren't really problems. And he never talks to the white pilots the way he talks to my dad, and he keeps trying to trick Dad instead of just watching him fly good." The analysis was both perceptive and damning, revealing patterns of differential treatment that characterized discriminatory evaluation designed to exclude rather than assess fairly. As Leon's evaluation concluded, with Inspector Martinez documenting exceptional performance across all federal requirements, while Morrison filed complaints alleging cultural incompatibility and civilian adaptation concerns, all participants understood that formal qualification was only the first step in challenging systematic discrimination that could find new ways to exclude competent professionals. "Mr. Washington," Inspector Martinez said as she completed her federal evaluation, Your performance exceeded commercial aviation standards in all technical areas, and I'm recommending full commercial certification based on demonstrated competence and regulatory compliance. The validation was both personally meaningful and professionally crucial, providing official documentation that could counteract discriminatory hiring practices with objective performance evidence. "Dad, you passed," Phoenix said, hugging her father with 9-year-old enthusiasm that temporarily overcame her analytical concern about adult workplace politics. But as Captain Morrison prepared to file additional complaints, alleging that Leon's federal certification didn't address company-specific culture and customer service requirements, both Diana and Leon understood that systematic discrimination rarely accepted defeat through individual qualification and often escalated resistance when confronted with evidence of its own bias. Some sacrificial choices require recognizing that challenging institutional discrimination often escalates rather than eliminates resistance, and that individual success may require institutional change to become sustainable rather than remaining isolated achievement. 6 weeks after federal aviation authorities had certified Leon's exceptional qualifications, while Captain Morrison continued filing complaints about his cultural incompatibility, Dr. Rebecca Torres arrived at Skyward Aviation to conduct what Diana had described as workplace dynamics consultation, but which represented the first systematic evaluation of hiring and advancement practices that the company had ever undertaken. "Mr. Washington," Dr. Torres said as she entered the conference room where Leon was reviewing flight safety protocols, "I've been following your certification process and the resistance you've encountered, and I wanted to discuss how your experience might inform aviation industry diversity training." Dr. Torres, an organizational psychologist who specialized in workplace discrimination and aviation safety culture, carried herself with the professional authority that came from years of helping companies recognize how bias could create both personnel problems and operational safety risks. "Dr. Torres, I appreciate your interest, but I want to be clear that my situation is still developing, and I'm not comfortable making broad statements about industry discrimination while I'm still seeking stable employment," Leon replied, his voice carrying the careful restraint he'd learned for managing professional exposure while navigating ongoing workplace conflicts. "Actually, Mr. Washington, I'm here because the Federal Aviation Administration has requested that I help Skyward Aviation develop safety culture protocols that address how discrimination and bias can create operational hazards in aviation environments," Dr. Torres explained, settling into her chair with materials that suggested she'd already reviewed extensive documentation about Morrison's resistance to Leon's employment. "They've also asked me to evaluate whether discriminatory hiring practices could be affecting aviation safety by excluding qualified personnel from commercial operations." The revelation meant that Leon's individual case had attracted federal attention as part of systematic concerns about how industry discrimination could compromise aviation safety through exclusion of competent professionals. "What kind of safety concerns are federal authorities considering?" Diana asked, her tone carrying strategic interest in information that could affect regulatory compliance and business operations. "Research indicates that discriminatory hiring practices can create groupthink environments where similar backgrounds and perspectives prevent identification of operational hazards, and that diverse flight crews demonstrate superior performance in emergency situations requiring creative problem-solving," Dr. Torres replied. The explanation provided regulatory framework for understanding discrimination as operational liability rather than just personnel issue, suggesting that inclusive hiring could improve safety performance rather than just satisfy diversity requirements. Over the following 2 hours, Dr. Torres presented findings from her preliminary assessment of how discrimination had affected aviation industry safety culture and operational effectiveness. Your company's pilot hiring has focused on candidates from similar backgrounds, similar training programs, and similar social networks, Dr. Torres continued, which creates operational homogeneity that can limit response effectiveness when diverse perspectives and experiences would improve safety outcomes. What you're describing sounds like diversity hiring rather than merit-based selection, Morrison interjected, his tone carrying resistance to suggestions that current hiring practices might be inadequate for operational excellence. Captain Morrison, what I'm describing is evidence-based selection that recognizes merit, includes diverse capabilities and experiences that improve operational outcomes, Dr. Torres replied. Military aviation experience, for example, provides crisis management skills and technical proficiency that often exceed civilian training standards. The conversation was interrupted by Phoenix's arrival from the youth aviation program that Diana had established to provide educational opportunities for employees' children while they observed their parents' professional environments. "Dad," Phoenix said, approaching with the confidence that had developed through weeks of witnessing her father's professional vindication, "Dr. Torres, I wanted to thank you for helping people understand that good pilots come from lots of different backgrounds. At 9, Phoenix had developed sophisticated understanding of workplace discrimination through observing her father's evaluation process and the resistance he'd encountered from Morrison and other aviation professionals. Phoenix, your father's experience has helped us understand important things about how the aviation industry can better recognize and utilize qualified professionals," Dr. Torres replied, her tone acknowledging that children often witness discrimination with clarity that adults learn to rationalize. "Dr. Torres," Phoenix continued, "I've been researching aviation accidents, and lots of them happened because all the pilots thought the same way, and nobody had different ideas about how to solve problems when things went wrong. The observation was both precocious and strategically relevant, demonstrating that diverse perspectives could provide safety advantages rather than just meeting regulatory diversity requirements. That's exactly the kind of analysis that supports evidence-based hiring practices," Dr. Torres said, recognizing that Phoenix's research had identified safety implications that many aviation professionals hadn't considered. Meanwhile, Morrison was experiencing increasing isolation as federal regulators and company leadership began questioning hiring practices that had excluded qualified candidates while maintaining operational homogeneity that could compromise safety performance. "Dr. Torres," Morrison said, "I want to be clear that aviation safety requires consistent training standards and proven competence rather than experimental diversity initiatives that could compromise operational reliability. Captain Morrison, Mr. Washington's performance evaluations demonstrate that military aviation training provides competence that meets or exceeds civilian standards in most operational areas," Dr. Torres replied. "Excluding such qualifications based on subjective criteria could actually compromise safety by limiting available expertise." The exchange revealed fundamental disagreement about whether diversity represented operational asset or liability, with federal regulators increasingly supporting evidence-based inclusion over traditional exclusionary practices. As their alliance solidified around developing hiring protocols that could improve both diversity and safety outcomes, all participants except Morrison understood that Leon's individual case had broader implications for industry practices that affected operational effectiveness as well as personnel equity. Diana, Dr. Torres said as their planning session continued, federal authorities are particularly interested in how aviation companies can systematically identify and prevent discrimination that could exclude qualified safety personnel from commercial operations. "What kind of systematic changes are they recommending?" Diana asked, recognizing that federal guidance could provide both regulatory compliance framework and competitive advantage through improved personnel selection. Evidence-based hiring criteria that focus on demonstrated competence rather than subjective cultural assessments, diverse evaluation panels that can identify bias in selection processes, and performance metrics that reward safety outcomes rather than demographic homogeneity, Dr. Torres replied. The recommendations were both practically sound and strategically advantageous, suggesting that inclusive hiring could improve business outcomes rather than just satisfy regulatory requirements. "What I've learned through this process," Leon said as their consultation concluded, "is that challenging aviation industry discrimination requires systematic change rather than individual qualification, because discriminatory practices can always find new criteria for exclusion unless institutional culture changes to support merit-based evaluation." Meanwhile, Phoenix was participating in the aviation education program that had been expanded to include diverse perspectives on flight safety and industry careers, where she was developing both technical knowledge and leadership skills. "Mr. Washington," said Angela Foster, the program coordinator, "Phoenix has shown exceptional analytical abilities and leadership potential during group projects about aviation safety culture and diversity." "What kind of leadership has she demonstrated?" Leon asked, proud of his daughter's development while concerned about age-appropriate expectations and responsibilities. "She's been helping other children understand that aviation safety benefits from having pilots with different backgrounds and experiences, and she's developed presentations about how discrimination can actually make flying more dangerous by excluding qualified people." Red, the leadership was both impressive and concerning, revealing that Phoenix was processing complex social and professional issues with sophistication that exceeded typical child development, while potentially taking on advocacy responsibilities that should remain adult obligations. Some alliances require recognizing that individual success becomes sustainable only when institutional change creates systematic support for inclusive practices rather than relying on exceptional individuals to repeatedly overcome discriminatory barriers. The question now was whether their collaboration could create aviation industry changes that would benefit future qualified professionals, or whether resistance would find new methods for maintaining exclusionary practices despite federal regulatory pressure and demonstrated safety benefits of inclusive hiring. The confrontation reached its peak when Captain Morrison orchestrated a coordinated campaign to discredit Leon's federal certification through fabricated safety complaints and systematic harassment designed to force his resignation before Diana could implement the inclusive hiring reforms recommended by Dr. Torres and federal aviation authorities. "Dad, Captain Morrison told other people at the airport that you're dangerous and shouldn't be allowed to fly," Phoenix said during their evening homework session, her 9-year-old voice carrying the controlled anger that characterized children who had learned to recognize when adults were being deliberately cruel to their families. Leon immediately understood that Morrison's resistance had escalated beyond professional disagreement to personal destruction campaign that threatened both his aviation career and Phoenix's sense of security about their family's place in the professional community. "Phoenix, Captain Morrison is saying those things because he's worried that having me as a pilot makes him look less important, not because there's anything wrong with my flying," Leon explained, using age-appropriate language while acknowledging the reality of workplace persecution. The attacks had escalated beyond internal company politics to systematic character assassination that included anonymous complaints to federal regulators alleging that Leon had falsified military records, demonstrated aggressive behavior toward passengers, and violated safety protocols during emergency operations. Mr. Washington, we've received multiple complaints questioning your federal certification and alleging safety violations that contradict our documented evaluation records. Special Agent Patricia Kim from the FAA's Office of Inspector General reported during their emergency meeting. Are these complaints based on documented incidents or anonymous allegations? Leon asked, recognizing the pattern of systematic harassment that had characterized his previous attempts to obtain civilian aviation employment. The complaints include specific allegations about flight operations, passenger interactions, and regulatory compliance, but they lack corroborating evidence and appear to contradict official performance evaluations from certified inspectors. Agent Kim replied. The strategy was both sophisticated and malicious, exploiting regulatory complaint processes to create official investigation files that could justify employment termination regardless of actual evidence or performance documentation. Meanwhile, Diana was experiencing her own confrontation with institutional resistance as Morrison's allies within the aviation industry launched coordinated attacks, alleging that her hiring practices compromised safety standards and violated industry cultural norms. Diana, the Regional Aviation Safety Council, has filed formal complaints alleging that Skyward Aviation's employment decisions create operational hazards by prioritizing diversity over qualified pilot selection, reported her legal counsel, James Martinez. What specific safety hazards are they alleging? Diana asked, recognizing that safety-based challenges to her employment decisions could create regulatory complications that affected her government contracts. They're claiming that military pilots lack appropriate civilian mindset for passenger operations, that your hiring practices create token diversity that compromises crew coordination, and that federal diversity requirements are forcing unsafe personnel decisions. The allegations were both professionally damaging and strategically designed to exploit regulatory concerns about aviation safety while concealing discriminatory motivations behind legitimate-sounding operational objections. James, these complaints directly contradict federal evaluation data and Inspector Martinez's certification recommendations, Diana replied. Are we dealing with safety concerns or coordinated resistance to inclusive hiring? Based on the timing and coordination of these complaints, this appears to be systematic resistance to your personnel decisions rather than legitimate safety advocacy. The assessment confirmed that Diana's commitment to merit-based evaluation was triggering industry retaliation designed to maintain exclusionary hiring practices through regulatory and legal pressure. As the confrontation intensified with Morrison's network filing additional complaints, while federal authorities investigated both the allegations and the complainants' motivations, Phoenix took matters into her own hands by conducting research that would expose the systematic nature of the discrimination her father was experiencing. Dr. Torres, I found something important about Captain Morrison and the people who are trying to hurt my dad's pilot job, Phoenix said during the family counseling session that had been established to help her process workplace conflicts affecting her father. What did you discover, Phoenix? Dr. Torres asked, recognizing that children often noticed patterns that adults missed or rationalized. I researched all the complaints against military pilots at different companies, and lots of them use exactly the same words and same reasons, like someone gave them a list of things to say to make military pilots look bad. The analysis was both sophisticated and devastating, revealing coordination among aviation professionals to exclude military veterans through standardized discrimination disguised as safety advocacy. Phoenix, can you show me this research? Dr. Torres asked, understanding that documentation of systematic discrimination could provide federal authorities with evidence needed to address industry-wide bias. I made charts showing how the same people file complaints against black pilots and military pilots using the same fake safety reasons, and how companies that don't hire diverse pilots have more accidents than companies that do hire them. The research was both methodologically sound and strategically powerful, demonstrating systematic discrimination while providing safety-based arguments for inclusive hiring practices. As Phoenix's documentation revealed the coordinated nature of resistance to Leon's employment and similar cases throughout the aviation industry, federal authorities began investigating not just individual complaints, but the networks of professionals who were systematically excluding qualified candidates. Agent Kim, Diana said during their federal consultation, Phoenix's research suggests that the complaints against Leon are part of coordinated discrimination rather than isolated safety concerns. Ms. Sterling, we've reached similar conclusions based on pattern analysis of complaint filings and regulatory challenge submissions, Agent Kim replied. We're investigating systematic discrimination that may be affecting aviation safety by excluding qualified personnel. What are the implications for Leon's certification and employment status? Mr. Washington's federal certification remains valid based on demonstrated competence, and the complaints against him appear to lack factual basis and may constitute regulatory harassment designed to circumvent anti-discrimination protections. The federal support was both validating and strategically crucial, providing official recognition that Leon's qualifications were legitimate while acknowledging that systematic discrimination required regulatory intervention rather than just individual resistance. Dad, the government people believe you're a good pilot, and the people saying mean things about you are lying, Phoenix reported to Leon following her interview with federal investigators. Phoenix, federal authorities are investigating the complaints to determine whether they're based on safety concerns or discrimination, Leon replied, using careful language while acknowledging his daughter's sophisticated understanding of the situation. I know they're discrimination because I researched them and found the pattern that shows Captain Morrison and his friends do this to lots of good pilots who aren't white, Phoenix said with 9-year-old clarity about systematic injustice. As federal authorities prepared to take action against discriminatory complaint networks, while Morrison faced potential regulatory sanctions for filing false allegations, Leon realized that his individual case had become part of systematic change that could benefit multiple qualified professionals who had been excluded from aviation careers. Dr. Torres, Leon said during their final consultation before federal hearings, what Phoenix discovered about coordinated discrimination suggests that my experience represents institutional problem rather than individual conflict. Leon, your case has helped federal authorities recognize systematic barriers that affect aviation safety by excluding qualified personnel. And Phoenix's research has provided documentation that supports regulatory intervention, Dr. Torres replied. Will this actually change hiring practices, or will the discrimination just find new methods? That depends partly on whether the aviation industry chooses to support evidence-based hiring or continues resistance that could trigger federal enforcement actions. Some confrontations with institutional discrimination require recognizing that individual cases can catalyze systematic change when supported by evidence and federal regulatory intervention, but that lasting transformation requires industry commitment to inclusive practices rather than just compliance with legal requirements. 18 months after federal authorities sanctioned Captain Morrison and 12 other aviation professionals for coordinated discrimination, Chief Pilot Leon Washington stood in Skyward Aviation's new Diversity and Safety Training Center. teaching a cohort of aviation industry executives about inclusive hiring practices that had become federal requirements following the Morrison investigation and subsequent regulatory reforms. The evaluation methods we're reviewing today, Leon explained to an audience of airline executives and flight operations directors, are designed to help you identify qualified pilots regardless of their backgrounds, while ensuring that safety standards remain the highest priority in aviation hiring. At 11 years old, Phoenix sat in the training room's family area, working on advanced aerospace engineering calculations, while simultaneously developing a research presentation about discrimination in aviation safety, her presence representing both the stability they had rebuilt and her ongoing commitment to advocacy that had helped catalyze industry-wide changes. Mr. Washington, asked David Chen from Pacific Airlines, how do you balance comprehensive diversity initiatives with the technical precision that aviation safety requires? The question reflected ongoing tension between inclusive hiring and safety concerns that had characterized industry adoption of federal anti-discrimination requirements. Mr. Chen, what we've learned is that diverse hiring actually improves aviation safety by ensuring that flight crews include different perspectives and problem-solving approaches that can prevent accidents caused by groupthink and similar decision-making patterns, Leon replied, his response based on 18 months of consulting with airlines implementing evidence-based hiring protocols. Federal data now confirms that diverse flight crews demonstrate superior performance in emergency situations, requiring creative solutions and collaborative decision-making. Diana, now wearing the confident demeanor of someone whose commitment to inclusive practices had transformed into industry leadership in aviation safety and diversity, observed this exchange with satisfaction that combined business success with personal pride in supporting Leon's professional rehabilitation and Phoenix's intellectual development. Since the federal investigation, Skyward Aviation had become the premier consulting firm for aviation industry diversity and safety training, generating over $200 million in annual revenue while helping dozens of airlines avoid discrimination lawsuits and improve operational safety through inclusive hiring practices. Leon, Diana said during the networking break following his presentation, the Department of Transportation has requested that we develop pilot training curricula for federal aviation academies. Are you interested in that level of government partnership? The opportunity represented both professional recognition and potential platform for systematic change that could affect pilot training nationwide, rather than just individual company practices. Diana, I'm honored by the recognition, but I need to consider how federal consulting visibility might affect Phoenix's educational development and our family's ability to maintain the balance we've established between professional advocacy and personal stability, Leon replied. What kind of considerations are you thinking about? High-profile federal work could create expectations for Phoenix to become a public advocate for aviation diversity. And I want to ensure that her intellectual development focuses on her own interests rather than carrying adult responsibilities for social change. The concerns reflected wisdom about balancing family well-being with professional opportunities that had developed through experiencing both the benefits and costs of challenging institutional discrimination through individual courage and systematic advocacy. Meanwhile, federal authorities were conducting their annual assessment of aviation industry compliance with anti-discrimination regulations, documenting progress that had exceeded initial projections for both hiring practices and safety outcomes. Leon, said Administrator Jennifer Walsh from the Federal Aviation Administration, the industry changes that resulted from your case and Phoenix's research have contributed to a 37% improvement in aviation safety metrics and a 62% increase in qualified pilot diversity across commercial aviation. The impact was both personally meaningful and professionally significant, demonstrating that individual courage, combined with systematic advocacy, could create institutional changes that protected both equal opportunity and operational safety. Administrator Walsh, what I've learned is that aviation safety requires not just technical competence, but diverse perspectives that can identify hazards and solutions that homogeneous crews might miss, Leon said. Your case helped us understand that discrimination doesn't just harm individual pilots. It creates safety risks by limiting the range of experience and problem-solving capabilities available during emergency situations, Administrator Walsh replied. As their conversation continued, Phoenix was participating in Skyward Aviation's Youth Aerospace program, where she was developing engineering skills while working on peer education projects about systematic bias and evidence-based decision-making. "Dad," Phoenix said, as they prepared to leave the office after her completion of the aerospace workshop, "I think I want to study aeronautical engineering and policy analysis in college so I can help design systems that prevent discrimination while improving safety." The aspiration represented both intellectual interest and emotional processing of their family's experience with institutional change through collaborative advocacy and systematic reform. "Phoenix, you have the analytical skills and ethical foundation to succeed in aerospace engineering if that's what you decide to pursue," Leon replied, using the supportive communication style he'd developed for encouraging her interests while ensuring that career expectations remained age-appropriate. "And if I become an aerospace engineer, I'll already understand that making flying safer requires having lots of different kinds of smart people working together, and that preventing discrimination actually helps everyone fly more safely." The insight reflected mature understanding of systems thinking and social justice that had developed through witnessing institutional change, emerge from individual courage supported by evidence-based advocacy. 6 months later, Leon stood in the kitchen of the 5-bedroom house in suburban Denver that his salary and consulting fees had made affordable, preparing dinner while reviewing materials for the MIT Executive Education Program in Aviation Safety and Diversity that he would teach the following semester. "Dad," Phoenix called from the living room where she was working on a science fair project about bias in technical decision-making, "can you help me understand why some people think that hiring the best pilots and having diverse pilots are different goals instead of the same goal?" The question was both academic assignment and personal inquiry about systematic thinking that had shaped their family's experience with institutional change. "Phoenix, people sometimes think diversity and excellence are competing priorities because they don't understand that excellence requires including all qualified people rather than just people from similar backgrounds," Leon explained, joining her at the dining room table, where her project materials included case studies of various industry discrimination and safety outcomes. "So when companies say they want the best pilots, but they only hire pilots who look the same and think the same way, they're actually not getting the best pilots?" "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Real excellence requires systematic evaluation that recognizes talent wherever it exists, rather than limiting opportunities to people who fit traditional expectations about what qualified professionals should look like." As they worked together on homework that combined academic learning with personal experience, both Leon and Phoenix understood that their family's transformation represented more than individual success. It demonstrated that systematic change was possible when individual advocacy was supported by evidence-based research and regulatory commitment to institutional reform. "Leon," Diana said during their quarterly business review, "I want to discuss international expansion of our aviation safety and diversity consulting to help airlines worldwide develop inclusive practices that improve both equity and operational outcomes. Are you interested in global impact work? The growth opportunity was both remarkable business development and recognition that their work had created expertise that could improve aviation safety and diversity globally rather than just domestically. Diana, I'm interested in international impact, but I want to ensure that our expansion maintains focus on evidence-based change rather than just compliance training, and that any global work includes educational opportunities for Phoenix that support her intellectual development. Some families, they had discovered, were strengthened rather than limited by confronting institutional discrimination when their courage was supported by systematic research, regulatory intervention, and collaborative commitment to evidence-based change that benefited entire industries rather than just individual careers. This story reminds us that systematic discrimination often masquerades as professional standards, but that evidence-based evaluation reveals talent in unexpected places while improving outcomes for everyone. In a world where bias can compromise both individual opportunity and institutional safety, Leon and Phoenix's partnership shows us that challenging discrimination requires both individual courage and systematic advocacy, supported by rigorous research and regulatory commitment to evidence-based practices. Sometimes the most profound victories happen when individual expertise catalyzes institutional changes that create opportunities for countless others while improving safety and effectiveness for entire industries. What qualified professionals might your organization be overlooking due to unconscious bias or systematic barriers? How could evidence-based evaluation help you identify talent that improves both diversity and operational excellence?